Hello and welcome to the Web Basics. Let's look at the topic that you're going to learn in this section. Well, after completing this section, you will be able to understand terms like protocol, HTTP, Internet, TCP IP and DNS and many more of it. This is like understanding the simple definitions of it and understand how these things work together. What is the purpose of a protocol? Why HTTP protocol was introduced? What is Internet? What is the role of TCP IP and how DNS works, right? We're going to see what are the DNS providers that is available in the market. Then we'll look at all the web hosting providers as well. Well, we're going to meet them by visiting their website and understand what are the offerings they provide in terms of DNS and the web hosting. You'll understand simple things like client server technology, how actually a website works, and type of the web servers that is available in the market. So we're going to look into web basics as a whole to understand how these things work together, starting from the definitions of simple terms like protocol, HTTP, going on to the architecture level, looking at client server technology, and understand how a website works and what type of components available in the website. Then we'll look at different languages we have, like programming versus scripting versus markup. So we'll understand what are the differences and why they are termed as programming, scripting and markup. Okay, then we'll look at what is the difference between a compiler and interpreter. We'll take a real-time example of programming languages and execute it to see what is the difference between compiler versus an interpreter. But it will be really an interesting session if you have hearing some of the terms for the first time, and if there are things that you haven't heard before or you're not very clear about, well, this section will help you to clear off all these doubts that you have. Okay, so let's move on to this section now. Hello and welcome to the Web Basics. Let's look at what is the communication challenge gap that we have. Okay, let's understand a challenge that we have in terms of communication and how this web actually help us to solve that challenge. So before that, let's understand what is the challenge. So let's meet two friends. One is Jim, and Jim is from USA, and one is Bob, he's from Australia. Okay, and Jim is thinking about something. So Jim is thinking, I want to buy a phone for a cheaper price. Okay, and he's looking for a phone in the market, and he's always thinking, how can I buy a cheaper price iPhone maybe, right? And Bob is in Australia. He want to sell a phone for a cheaper price. Well, there are two different kinds of people. One is called as buyer, who want to buy things, and one is called as seller, who want to sell things, right? And what is the challenge that they have? They have this communication gap. The gap between buyer and seller. Buyer want to buy it and seller want to sell it. Well, how they can find themselves and how the communication gap can be reduced. This is the challenge here. That's basically the communication gap between a buyer and a seller. Okay, let's understand two challenges that we have. Well, challenge number one is the language. Does Jim and Bob speak same language? That's the first challenge. The second language is a distance. How Jim can find Bob? Well, to solve this communication challenge, you have to solve these two problems. The first problem is, does Jim and Bob speak same language? So you have to agree on to one language, and then you also have to solve a distance problem where Jim and Bob can communicate with each other irrespective of their distance. So let's take this challenge and understand this, and let's understand what are the definitions of protocol, TCP IP, Internet in terms of solving these two challenges. The challenge number one is the language, where does Jim and Bob speak same language? The challenge 2 is a distance, how Jim can find Bob. Okay, so that's the challenge of communication gap. Let's understand the other things. Welcome to the lecture. Let's understand what is protocol. Let's do a quick review of what challenges we are solving it here. So we have seen up the communication gap between Jim and the Bob, wherein Jim is a buyer, Bob is a seller. Jim want to buy a phone and Bob want to sell the phone. The two challenges is challenge 1 is the language challenge, where Jim and Bob speak same language. The challenge 2 is the distance, how Jim can find Bob. Okay, so let's move on. Okay, so this is the challenge. Let's see how we'll solve this challenge. So let's understand what is protocol. Okay, so Jim staying in USA and Bob staying in Australia, they might be speaking different languages. Okay, so the first thing they have to have is the agreement of the language. If they want to communicate, they have to say, okay, let's speak a similar language. Okay, so that we can have an agreement of a language first, so that we can speak, right? and that is nothing but a set of rules. Well, language is nothing but a set of rules, right? Language defines of what alphabets to use, how you pronounce them, and what words do you use, right? So these are basically the rules of a language. So in terms of protocol, protocol is nothing but set of rules. Okay, and two people communicate each other, they just typically agree onto a language. So if they speak the same language, then the communication can happen, right? In terms of a protocol, protocol is nothing but set of rules. Well, if Jim and Bob want to communicate with each other, the Jim says, let's speak in English. Then Bob says, all right, let's talk. So the communication gap has been removed. That is the first level of communication called as language communication, right? They agree onto a protocol, and protocol define what rules to use for that communication. Okay, so understand this concept of a protocol. When someone say what is protocol, it is nothing but set of rules, right? It is a rule using which you establishing the communication. In between the two people, we agree onto a language, could be an English language, right? And once we agree onto the language, then the communication can happen. Well, that solves the first problem. Does Jim and Bob speak same language, right? When they agree onto a similar protocol, so there has to be an agreement of protocol first. When two people want to communicate, there has to be an agreement of protocol so that these two people can communicate. Okay, so let's move and understand how these things happen in terms of computers. Well, how to system communicate? Even for a system to communicate, they have to follow a protocol, so that when a system communicate with each other, they first define what is the rules we're going to use to communicate. That is the first transaction that happens between the two systems. That is nothing but they follow a same protocol. They agree onto a protocol first before the communication can happen. Okay, so let's take an example. So think of an example of a TV via your remote. Your remote is trying to control your TV. How do you think your TV remote can talk to your TV? That's basically an agreement of protocol called as infrared protocol. This is the protocol that is programmed in the TV remote and also in the TV so that they communicate via this protocol. Take another example of your phone via your Wi-Fi devices. You use nothing but a Wi-Fi protocol. So there is an agreement of protocol wherein your phone basically can talk to a Wi-Fi device. And also if it's a headphone, can you guess what is the protocol that we use to connect your headphone to your phone? Well, that's right, that is your Bluetooth protocol. So you see, for every devices to connect, irrespective of mobile devices or any of the hardware devices, there has to be an agreement first. So remember this, there is an agreement always happening between your devices before the actual communication can happen, before the actual data transfer happens. So they agree onto the same protocol. Okay, same set of rules, agreement of a same language. So now when Jim uses his PC to communicate with the Bob PC, okay, they use a protocol called as TCP/IP. We're going to deep dive into TCP/IP protocol in the next lecture. But on a very high level, we say that when two PC communicate, they have to agree onto a protocol. Okay, and if two PC want to transfer data, they agree onto a protocol called as TCP/IP. TCP/IP is a protocol using which we can transfer information between computers, and obviously you know the information between computers is zeros and ones. So all the zeros and ones that has to be transferred over between two computers is happening via this TCP/IP protocol. We're going to deep dive into what is this protocol all about in the next lecture. But on a very high level, understand this now. When Jim computer want to talk to Bob computer, they use something called as TCP/IP protocol. Now how this communication typically happens, right? The first thing that happens is Jim send a request. That's where the data transfer of TCP/IP happens. Someone has to initiate the request. So Jim PC basically send a request to Bob PC saying that, hey, I want to buy an iPhone. Then Bob PC can respond saying that, okay, this is my response and I'm interested to sell my phone to you. Okay, so that's basically the communication that is happening between the two PCs. And that's how the challenge that we have seen previously, how Jim can buy a phone and Bob can sell a phone, challenge can be solved via this communication. Okay, so let's understand what is a protocol. So what is protocol? Protocol is nothing but set of rules. Remember this definition forever. Okay, if someone asks you what is a protocol, think it has a set of rules, some rules that is being defined already in that protocol. So protocol is nothing but a set of rules that defines how to communication can happen between the two devices. As I told you, two devices has to agree on to the protocol first, then the communication can happen. Every machine is programmed with a protocol, that is nothing but the rules to communicate. If two computers are talking, if two hardware is talking, if a machinery is talking to another machinery, there is something called as protocol already been defined. Okay, the protocol is something like an handshake. They first say, okay, let's start communicating, and this is the language I'm going to use. Then the other person agrees to that language, then the communication happens. Okay, so devices agree on a common protocol before they communicate. This is a very, very important line that you have to remember always when you think of communication between the two devices. Any two devices in the world that you take in, they first agree onto a protocol. Once they agree onto a protocol, then they start communicating on that protocol. And what is a protocol? Protocol is a set of rules. Well, here is some of the examples we have seen previously. Protocol is a set of rules to communicate. Your phone can talk to your Wi-Fi devices using a Wi-Fi protocol. Computer can talk to a server, download files, upload files via an FTP protocol. You are sending emails, then obviously it is basically an email protocol. Well, that basically solves the first challenge, that is the language challenge. And the language challenge is solved via the protocol. So they first agree onto a protocol. So in terms of Jim computer and the Bob computer, they agree onto a protocol called as TCP/IP protocol. And Jim initiate the request to say, I want to buy a phone. The Bob send a response to Jim saying that, okay, I'm going to sell the phone to you. Well, so challenge 1, that is a language challenge. Does Jim and Bob speak same language? Is solved via agreeing onto a protocol. Okay, and what is a protocol? Protocol is a set of rules. So let's look at the challenge number 2, that is a distance. How Jim computer can find Bob computer. Okay, so let's understand this definition by understanding what is internet. All right, so let's jump in another lecture, understand what is internet. Hello and welcome to the lecture. Let's understand what is internet. So let's look at the problem that we are solving it here. We have solved the first challenge, that is the language challenge, how Jim and Bob can speak the same language. We have solved it. Now Jim and Bob agree on to the same language and then they communicate. So let's understand the language number 2, that is the distance problem, right? How Jim computer can find Bob computer. And in terms of understanding how they solve this problem, we'll understand what is internet as well. So let's look at this example of transfer of information via the computers. We said that we will use TCP/IP protocol. TCP/IP protocol is basically helps you to transfer information from one computer to another computer. Okay, let's take an example of your TV remote via a TV, where we agree on to a protocol saying that infrared protocol is used to communicate between your TV remote and your TV. So that's not a problem. So communication can happen. You can control your TV with your remote. But the problem is there is no distance problem between your TV remote and your TV. Okay, obviously we know if you take your remote and go out of your house and try to control your TV, it will not happen because your distance is a problem, right? That's where the challenge that we are trying to solve it here. When there is a distance, how they find each other, right? How they try to communicate when there is a distance. Well, if there is no distance, then there's no problem. Like if you stay in your home, your Wi-Fi is not a problem. If your headphone is nearby you, then that's not a problem. If you move away from your headphone to your phone, then the distance challenge come in picture. Language is not a problem because once the distance is not a problem, language is not a problem. Language has been agreed, but when the distance come in picture, then that's where the challenge that you have to solve. Okay, so let's understand if distance is a problem, how do you solve that challenge of communication? And in terms of Jim and Bob, okay, Jim stays in USA and Bob stays in Australia. Obviously distance is a problem here. And how Jim computer can talk to Bob computer when they live in two different regions so far away. Okay, so let's understand how this problem can be solved. So let's understand what is internet. Okay, internet is a network. Okay, remember it is a network where group of computers connected together with a single wire. You have all these computers in the internet, they all connected with one wire, irrespective of where they stay. If you are connected to an internet, you are actually saying we all are connected via a single wire. And why you have to connect via a single wire? So that you can find each other. Well, think of how the current flows in through your house. Okay, all the current that we flows in through our house is via the power cables, right? All the power cables or the current cables that is connected all over the world, sending all this current back to our house, right? Similarly, in internet, all the computers are connected to either via single wire so that the information can be passed via these computers and they can be reachable via the single wire. Okay, so that's the concept of an internet. So when someone say what is internet, it is nothing but a network, right? It's nothing but a network where all the computers are basically communicated with a single wire, so they can communicate, they can find themselves and they can communicate. Okay, so let's look at what is the purpose of internet. All the computers in internet can find each other and connect. That is the only purpose that internet exists. So let's take a step back. Now let's understand Jim and Bob's problem. Well, Jim's computer is in USA and Bob's computer is in Australia. So with the help of the internet, means if Jim computer can connect to an internet and Bob computer can connect to the internet, then they all are connected via a single wire, and now they can find themselves, because internet is a network where all the computers can be reachable, can be found, right? They can be found, they can be connected, and you can send information between the two systems via the same protocol, that is TCP/IP protocol. Okay, so that's how the internet can solve the problem of the distance. So once Jim can find Bob computer via the internet, then Jim can send a request to say buy phone and Bob can say send request to sell the phone. That's how the Jim computer can find Bob computer via the internet. So let's look at the definition of an internet. Let's do a quick reference of what we have seen so far. Internet is a network where group of computers connected together with a single wire. Systems connected in the internet network are able to communicate with each other and exchange data. That is the main purpose of internet. You can connect to internet to access other computers and exchange data via TCP/IP protocol. So that's the purpose, right? So if Jim want to find Bob computer, they connect to internet so that they now can be visible and they can connect with other computers that is visible in the internet as well. Well, that's the purpose of internet. So let's understand whether we have really solved the Jim and Bob's problem. Well, we have seen Jim can now connect to internet, Bob can connect to internet, everything is fine. They can find themselves and they can connect themselves. But there's one problem. There are billions of computers in the internet. With billions of computers in the internet, how Jim computer can uniquely identify saying that, oh, this is a Bob computer, let me send a request to buy phone. Okay, internet is a place where you can connect to all the computers, but how do you identify them? How do you identify a specific computer in the internet? That's the challenge, right? How Jim computer can identify Bob computer. Let's understand how this problem can be solved. Okay, and this problem of identifying computers can be solved via this protocol called as TCP/IP protocol. TCP/IP protocol is a protocol used to exchange data. It has some definitions also attached to it. Means you have a set of rules to follow. Once you follow this and you are reachable, then TCP/IP will take care of communicating to a specific computer in the internet. Okay, so let's understand what is TCP/IP and understand how you can solve this challenge, like how Jim computer can identify Bob computer. Okay, so let's look into that in the next lecture. Hello and welcome to the lecture. Let's understand what is TCP/IP protocol. Let's do a quick recap of what challenge we were stopped at in the previous lecture. Well, Jim computer can connect to internet, Bob computer can connect to internet, and they can find themselves. But the challenge in internet, there are billions of computers. So how to uniquely identify the computers? How Jim computers can identify Bob computer? Okay, so let's solve this challenge by understanding the TCP/IP protocol. Let's take an example of internet, right? In internet, we say there are billions of computers. So how can you uniquely identify them? You can uniquely identify them by giving them a unique number, right? Once you give them a number, okay, then you can uniquely identify them using that number. And this number is basically nothing but an IP address. Okay, every computer have a unique address, that is the number in the internet, which is called as IP address. So every computer that connects to the internet gets this unique address. There cannot be duplicate of unique addresses. There has to be unique addresses when you connect to an internet. Even though you are connecting to the internet via your Wi-Fi, you actually get a dynamic IP address in the internet, so that you are identified uniquely in the internet. Okay, so what is IP address stands for? IP stands for Internet Protocol that is used in the internet to communicate between the systems. Once you have an IP address, then you can identify yourself and then the communication can happen. Example could be like an phone number for every SIM. How do you identify a unique phone in the whole world? You have a phone number. And how do you reach to your friends? Like how do you make a call? You call via the phone number. Similarly, in internet, if you want to reach to a computer, you reach via the unique address that is nothing but the IP address. So that solves the challenge of identifying a computer in an internet by assigning each computer an unique address. Let's understand what are the details of its unique address, and this address is called as IP address. So once the IP address is assigned to each of the computers in the internet, now using this protocol called as TCP/IP protocol, they can uniquely identify that particular IP address, and then they can establish a connection and transfer the data. Okay, that's the rules of a protocol, that you need to have an IP address first, and that using that IP address, this TCP/IP protocol will communicate, establish the communication and transfer the data. Okay, so every computer in internet has a unique IP address, and TCP/IP is a protocol used to connect and communicate. Remember these definitions of what is IP address, what is a TCP/IP, what is the purpose of TCP/IP, and how IP addresses are assigned to the computers, and why you need to have a unique IP address in the internet is just to find themselves and establish a communication. Okay, so let's understand how the IP address looks like. So IP address is basically unique addresses which is separated with something called as dot. So if you look at here an example, 192.87.45.20, this is a number that is assigned to a computer in the internet, and this is how you represent an IP address. Let's look at an example of what is an IP address. So I have opened up a command prompt. Okay, so how to find my IP address? Okay, you can go to ipconfig. Once you click on ipconfig, you will see something called as IP address. An IP address is separated with a dot. Okay, and it has 3 numbers in it. Okay, that's how a IP address is being assigned to a computer, and this is a dynamic number. Whenever I log off from the internet and log in again into the internet, maybe this number will change. Okay, and every computer in the internet has something called as IP address. Okay, and if you have to find an IP address of yahoo.com, you can say www.yahoo.com. okay, you will find the IP address here. Okay, we'll understand what is this and what is this. This we know is an IP address. This is called as host name. So in the next section of what is DNS, we'll understand what is this and how this thing work. But for now, focus on what is the IP address. This is the address using which I can use the yahoo.com server. If you want to ping the google.com, okay, you can find an IP address. However, this will be dynamic for Google because they have many servers, right? So you might be reaching to a different server every time you do a ping. Okay, that's a different concept altogether, but remember for now that every computer in the internet can be found via this something called as IP address, and it looks like this. You have 3 integers dot, then 3 integers dot, 3 integers dot, 3 integers. Okay, so that's how the IP address is used to identify a computer in the internet. So now that you know what is an IP address and how it look like, let's do a quick recap of what is TCP/IP. TCP stands for Transmission Control Protocol and is used to connect and transfer data. Remember this definition of TCP/IP. The purpose of TCP/IP is basically to connect and transfer the data. To connect, it has to find out what is the IP address first. So in order TCP/IP to work, it should know what is the IP address. And IP stands for Internet Protocol, using which any computer can be identified with a unique IP address. We have seen yahoo.com, google.com. By just doing a simple ping or using a command called ipconfig, you can find your own computer IP address. When you are connected your PC to an internet, you will definitely have a unique IP address, and that is nothing but the internet protocol. And now you can connect to internet to access other computers and exchange data via the TCP/IP protocol. So how you can access Google, how you can access Yahoo, all these computers that is Google is hosting or Yahoo is hosting can be reachable via the IP address. Alright, so let's go back to Jim and Bob's problem. So now Jim computer can identify Bob computer via a unique IP address. If you look at the diagram here, every computer that is in the internet have a unique IP address, and then the TCP/IP protocol now can work. The transfer of data can work, and each computer can identify itself with a unique number. So the problem of Jim computer identifying the Bob computer is really solved by using the IP address. Okay, with the IP address, everyone can reach to any computer that they want. It's similarly to your phone numbers. You can reach to any phone by dialing that phone number. So there's one more challenge attached to this. Well, however, there is one challenge attached to this. Let's understand what is that challenge. Well, it is hard to remember billions of IP addresses. You see, the IP addresses is so funny. Well, IP addresses are hard to remember because these are integers. And if you have billions of computer, you really cannot remember these numbers. And if it is dynamic, let's say you're connecting to internet and then you're logging off, again connecting, then you get a dynamic number. So it's again not a static number, right? It might be dynamic number, or it could be a number that is very hard to remember. So the challenge is, how do you remember these numbers? This number can be remembered via a DNS name, that is the domain name service. Think of how do you store a phone number in your phone, right? There is a phone number, and then in the context you add the name to it. That name is nothing but domain name. Let's understand domain name in the next lecture. Welcome to the lecture to understand what is DNS, that is domain name service. Let's look at what challenge we're going to solving it here with the DNS. We said that every computer in the internet have a unique IP address, and this is how the IP address looks like, but it's hard to remember billions of IP addresses, right? So how do you solve that challenge? So let's understand that. Well, that can be solved via something called as DNS. Okay, every computer in the internet which has an IP address, you can give an English name that is easy to remember name. That is nothing but domain name service, DNS. Okay, DNS is nothing but an English name or an easy to remember name for your computer which has an IP address. Remember, you need to have an unique IP address, and to that unique IP address you assign the domain name system. And why do you do it? Why I have to give a domain name for an IP address? I can just use the IP address as I want. I don't want to have a domain name. Well, there's no problem, right? You can connect to any computer via the TCP/IP. That is the rule of the protocol. You need to have an IP address. It's not a rule that you should have a DNS name, but you can even connect to any computer via the IP address. That's fine. But imagine a situation wherein you have to remember thousands of phone numbers, right? What you typically do is, you in the contact list you assign a name to a phone number so that you don't have to remember the phone number. And really it is hard to remember numbers, and it's easy to remember name because the numbers are complex and it is difficult to remember. We have something called as domain name system which gives us an English name to our IP address. Okay, so let's take an example. Okay, so we have a computer in the internet having this IP address. We can assign a host name or a domain name. You can even call this domain name or a host name something called as phptraining.com. And once this name is assigned to this IP address, so if you have to find the phptraining.com server, you don't have to remember the IP address now. You only have to say phptraining.com and you will connect to my computer. Okay, so remember, there is a linkage between your IP address and your host name. You have to create this link. First of all, you have to have this domain name purchased. Again, the domain name has to be unique, obviously, right? So you have to have a unique domain names, and each domain name is assigned to a computer's IP address. Well, if you want to have a name for your computer in the internet, you have to buy the domain name. Okay, so let's understand who sell this. So there are two types of providers in the market. One is called as web hosting providers. One is called as domain name providers. The web hosting providers sell space in the server. Typically, web hosting providers have the servers with IP addresses in the internet, and these servers are very huge. Okay, they have tons of space available. They have internet attached to it. It is in the internet and can be found with an IP address. So instead of putting our own server in the internet, we go to these web hosting providers and then we buy some space from them. Once you buy the space, you get that IP address and the space from the web hosting providers. Okay, and then you want to assign a domain name, that is the English name for your IP address. You go to something called as domain name providers, who basically sell a domain name, and once you buy the domain name, you have to do a configuration. You have to say this is my domain name and this is my IP address. If someone is trying to access your domain name, that request is sent to the web hosting provider. So remember, there are two types of providers: web hosting providers and domain name providers. Web hosting providers sell space. They have unique IP addresses, so they sell space in their server. Domain name providers sell that English names that you can buy. It has to be unique in the internet and you can attach to that IP address. Okay, so let's look at an example who are providing the web hosting providers and also domain names. Okay, so let's look at the web hosting providers. So HostGator is one of the vendor or the provider in the market who provide web hosting, and they provide web hosting for $2.75 per month, and they have their own plan. Okay, so let's look at different plans that they have. You have dedicated hosting, means you get the full control of the PC. You have dedicated control, full root access and scalable resources. There's some differences in the performances here. Then they have the web hosting for WordPress. You want to install WordPress, they have special softwares to do that. Then they have a simple drag and drop where you don't get very much control on the server, but you get this softwares to create websites. Okay, so let's look at their plan of web hosting. You click on web hosting. So here are their plan. Okay, and many of them, all the plans come up with this unmetered bandwidth, means you have unlimited bandwidth, so you don't run out of the bandwidths of the internet. And what they are saying is single domain, unlimited domain, and unlimited domains means you can point n number of domain names to this one server. For hatchling plan, you can have single domain. For baby plan, you can have unlimited domains, and similarly for business, you can have unlimited. But once you go to business plan, you get this dedicated IP. For hatchling and baby, you will definitely get an IP address, but that is shared with others. Okay, and when you go to business plan, you get this dedicated IP address. Okay, and you'll get the free access certificate and you get many other components of it. The most important thing that you have to understand is they are selling space in the server. They have this server, massive server, and they are selling space in their servers. So you get the space, you get the IP address, some are shared, some are dedicated, and you pay the price to get those details. If you click on technical specs, right, you will see some of the details of that server, and they'll tell you what other offerings they are giving you. Like in terms of programming and database, they give you MySQL installed on that server. You get that cPanel to access, you get email feature, you get all this support and all those tools available. Okay, so they are actually selling you a space on the server with some software installed on it. Okay, similarly you can go to Bluehost. Bluehost also have web hostings. Okay, they have WordPress specially hosting, e-commerce hosting, and they get dedicated hosting as well. Dedicated hosting is one server, they give it to you and you have the full control of that server. And when they talk about server, obviously they talk about cores, space, RAM, bandwidth, IP addresses. They're really talking about computer, right? They're talking about computer which is in the internet and have an public IP addresses. So first thing you have to do is you have to buy a space, right? You have to buy a space, and you have to buy a space in any of the servers. You can start small, like $2 per month, or you can go up to dedicated hosting where you get to have your own server, and you can get to choose what kind of server you want and even what OS you want, right? That is the first step. So these are the vendors. One is HostGator, another is Bluehost, and there's DigitalOcean as well. In DigitalOcean, you create something called as droplets. Okay, Let's look at what is the droplet. Let's look at Ubuntu. And to create the droplets, they give you a price. Let's say you want 1 CPU, 25 GB SSD disk, 1 terabyte of transfer, that's the bandwidth, 1 GB of RAM. You have to pay $5 per month. So they'll give you this server, and then you are on your own. You do install whatever you want to install on that server. So these are called as web hosting providers. They provide space in that server. They even provide you server access. They even let you choose what type of servers you want, and then you have to just pay the price. Okay, once you buy the space and the IP address, you need to have an unique English names, right? And where do you buy the English names? You buy that from a domain name provider. And if you go to godaddy.com, so godaddy.com is really very famous for selling domain names. So the first thing, when you go to their homepage, they'll ask you what is the domain name you're searching for. Okay, similarly, if you go to namecheap.com, they will help you find a domain name. Once you purchase a domain name, then you can go inside the configuration to configure a domain name with the IP address. Okay, so let's do a quick check of what is the domain name available or not. Let's say you want to buy yahoo.com, then they'll say yahoo.com is taken, you cannot have it. Okay, so domain names are unique. It's an English name that you're buying. You're not assigning it to a server first, right? You will buy this, and then once you have this server, they'll give an IP address. Then you do the linkage between this server and that server. That's a configuration altogether. But remember, on a high level, there are two different kind of people in the market. One is the web hosting provider, that is the HostGator, Bluehost, DigitalOcean. They are giving you the web server. They're giving you a server with a space in it, and then they have a unique IP address. There are another type of providers who provide you the domain name. They are selling the domain name so that you can assign this domain name to this IP addresses. So it's easy to see you have two different kind of providers in the market. One is really selling the web hosting, another is selling the domain name. So now that we have seen the web hosting providers and domain name providers, let's understand how the DNS works. Okay, so let's take a step back. Let's say Bob has purchased the web hosting, and also he has purchased the domain name, and he has assigned his domain name to his IP address. Well, remember this: when Jim types bob.com, the computer doesn't understand DNS name. The computer only understands IP addresses. The TCP/IP protocol, the rule says you need to have a unique IP address. The rule never talks about DNS. So yeah, there should be a way to convert your host name into an IP address, and that is done via something called as DNS servers. So in the internet, there will be so many DNS servers always syncing each other to tell that this, based on this DNS name, this is the IP address. So once you purchase from godaddy.com, they sync that detail. Like let's say you purchase yahoo.com, then the godaddy.com will sync those details of your DNS server to all the DNS servers in the internet. Okay, so remember, there is a DNS server in the internet which converts your host name, that is the domain name, to the IP address. Once you find the IP address, then that Bob computer can be uniquely identified in the internet. Then the TCP/IP protocol can help to connect and communicate the message to that particular system. Okay, so that's the role of the DNS server. So if you look at the internet as a whole, right, every computer has an IP address, and every computer get to have an DNS name. Okay, and then there are DNS servers sitting in the internet. Whenever someone types the DNS, then that DNS is converted into an IP address first, and then the communication happens on that IP address. In the previous example, when you say ping yahoo.com, ping google.com, the yahoo.com and google.com are nothing but the English names, right? They are DNS names, and conversion of that DNS name into an IP address is done by the DNS server. So remember, in the internet there are DNS servers. The job of the DNS server is to convert the DNS name into an IP address. And once the conversion happens, then it's easy to find those servers in the internet. Alright, so let's do a definition of what is DNS. So DNS stands for domain name system. That's the full form of DNS. Well, DNS name can also be called as host name, and the main purpose is to easy to remember names that is assigned to an IP address of a computer in the internet. Okay, because it is hard to remember IP address, we buy this domain name, we assign the domain name to the IP address, And in the internet, the DNS server take care of converting that domain name into an IP address. Okay, so DNS server basically helps to convert host name to IP address. You have to remember this concept, because once you buy the domain name, you need to know there are DNS servers, okay, which actually helps to convert the host names to IP address. And then you have to purchase the domain name, and once you purchase them, you have to do this setting by yourself. No one is going to do this for you, because no one knows what is your IP address. So once you buy the domain name, you have to map this IP address to the domain name. Okay, so understand this concept of how DNS work and what are the components of it, and what you have to do once you buy the domain name as well. So let's look at the problem that we have seen with Jim and Bob. So now Jim and Bob can identify themselves with the IP address, and also with the DNS. Now Bob can buy an DNS name, that is bob.com, and then he can match this bob.com with the IP address, and Jim can find Bob computer via the bob.com, that is nothing but the DNS name. So now we have solved the challenge of how Jim can really find the Bob computer, but there's one more challenge. Let's look at it. Well, the challenge is you can use TCP/IP protocol to transfer the data, any data, right? But you want to transfer a specific files, like the text files, pictures and videos. Then what protocol can help? TCP/IP is basically a transport protocol. What is mean by transport protocol? It's basically doesn't understand what you're transferring. It just transfers zeros and ones, right? It is just the purpose of TCP/IP is to find that computer via the IP address and transfer the data. It doesn't really care what you're transferring. Okay, but if you want to take a level up and then say, okay, I just want to transfer files, pictures and videos. These are nothing but the file formats, right? And you want to transfer this from Jim computer to Bob computer, or you want to pull those information from the Bob computer, where protocol can help. Okay, that can be done via the HTTP protocol. So let's understand what is HTTP in the next section. Hello and welcome to the lecture. So let's understand what is HTTP. So let's understand what protocol can help to transfer files, pictures and videos, because Bob want to send maybe the image of a phone to the Jim to show that this is how his phone looks like, and maybe Jim can fill up a form and then process his payment via transferring his data to the Bob. Okay, so there has to be communication between Jim and Bob via the specific formats, that is basically files, pictures or videos, right? And what protocol use? We can use TCP/IP, because TCP/IP isn't transport, it's an underlying protocol. The responsibility of TCP/IP is just to transfer the data irrespective of the format. Okay, so let's understand what is the protocol that we'll use. The protocol that we'll use is HTTP protocol, and HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. When I say hypertext, well, hypertext is nothing but your videos, pictures, music files and normal CSV files. These are called as hypertext. So if you want to transfer hypertext between the computers, you have to use a protocol called as Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And HTTP is an application protocol, means it is abstraction. It is one layer on top of TCP/IP protocol, and that is protocol that is used to transfer data like images, video files over the web. So remember, in the web, when two computers can find each other with a unique IP addresses, and then there is a connection between the two computers via the TCP/IP, there's one more protocol built on top of TCP/IP protocol called as HTTP protocol. And using this HTTP protocol, you can transfer these hypertext files. Okay, as I say, hypertext is nothing but the media files like images, videos, files, and you can transfer it via the HTTP. So when we talk about details of HTTP and web, you are more focusing on these kind of data like JSON file, XML file, video file, images file, because this protocol is built in such a way that it is able to handle and transfer this kind of files over the web. And remember that HTTP will depend on TCP/IP protocol to transfer the data. But how the data should be transferred, what kind of data, is basically handled with the HTTP. And obviously it is a protocol, so it has set of rules. How do you make a communication? How do you initiate the communication? What type of request that you have to send? All this been pre-coded into HTTP. So when Jim types bob.com onto the browser, he's basically using something called as HTTP protocol. Okay, and this HTTP protocol is responsible for communicating between the Bob's computer and transferring all the data from Bob's computer to the Jim computer. So let's do a quick definition of what is HTTP. HTTP stands for Hypertext Transfer Protocol. That's the definition of it. Because HTTP purpose is to transfer the hypertext, that's why it's called as Hypertext Transfer Protocol. And HTTP protocol is used to transfer images, videos, files over the web. Obviously, HTTP uses TCP protocol to transfer the data packets between system, and it is built on top of TCP. So that's all about HTTP protocol. Let's understand how HTTP actually works in the internet. So we go details of how HTTP works and we'll understand the details of it.